So here we have one of them in the parameter regime where it doesn't reproduce, it just stays there. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to suck away food. So this black square is an absence of food. And if I bring this close to the spot, it perturbs it, and then it comes back to equilibrium again, but in a different place. So it's changed, in a trivial way, but it's changed. If the perturbation is too strong, then it's precarious. If I feed in food, it will, oops. So it can overfeed. If I carefully feed in food, it will move towards it and then reproduce. So don't. I'm not trying to say that look, it's cognitive, because otherwise I would be saying, look, this is cognitive. But it is interesting that it does respond in a slightly non-trivial way to perturbations. Here is the cool thing. What happens if I add another thing that eats the first thing? So this adds a kind of permanent perturbation, and what you'll see after a while is that this can form these single spots, but it can also form these ones that are like spots, but with a tail moving behind them. So this green, the W, is just eating the V. It's not good for it in any way, but it can be. So here's the interesting thing. So what I'm doing now is, this is just without the tail. This is the same spot pattern as before. This G is a parameter of the environment, and when this gets lower, it gets harder for this chemical to make more of itself. And what's going to happen as this gets lower and lower and lower is that these eventually won't be able to survive, and they'll all die. They'll all die out. In the interests of time, I'm not going to show you that, but you can trust me. Now, if we add the parasite, then well, what happens? Then these things, it forms a kind of tail. These things begin to move around, and the fact that they move around has an interesting effect, because the reason that they die out is that they locally use up all the food that's surrounding them, and then there's nothing left for them to eat, and that's why they die. So the food here is invisible, but it's there. The moving ones, because they're moving, are constantly moving into new areas where there is food. And so although this red stuff is eating the blue stuff, chemically speaking, it's consuming the blue stuff, it actually contributes to its autopoiesis, if you want to use that word. So now we've reached a point where only the blue and the red can survive, and the blue on its own can't. So these are now, in a sense, much more precarious than just the blue ones, because if you want to make one of these now in this environment with G equal to 1.044, you can't do it unless you have the blue and the red both in the same place. So this, I hope, kind of sort of a bit addresses your point that life is about evolution and becoming more complex and that kind of thing. And you can see this as a kind of accumulation of an adaptation, because the tail is a heritable trait. The ones with tails reproduce into ones that also have tails. So I'm going to make this kind of the last slide. This system is a nice example where you have this thing is like an individual sustained by a network of processes that includes things on the chemical level, but also on the behavioral level, because the blue is what enables the red to exist, and the blue and the red together is what enables the whole thing to move, and the whole thing moving is what enables the blue to persist. So I have some concluding slides. I think I might not go through them. There was a lot I could have said about the role of information and representations and so on, obviously with these signs up. There's a lot more I could have said about the origin of life. The point of this is that a lot of approaches to the origin of life kind of assume that you have to start with something that's already really quite complex, whereas this point is just to show that in physics it's kind of easy for things that are somehow lifelike to emerge, and that we ought to be starting there. And then there are suggestions of where we could go. In particular, these simulations only have a finite number of things that can possibly happen, and it would be nice to get more open-ended so that you could really see the emergence of complexity. So here are some questions for discussion, and I'll leave those up while we discuss. So thank you.
About the first one, it kind of strikes me that most of the example you showed, if you compute properly the integrated information, most of the time it's probably about zero, I guess, because there are some kind of interactions and feedback and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in the deep sense, maybe there's something to feel like almost non-lifelike, object to be. And also, lots of arrows also, seems to connect with some kind of phenomenology that Einstein is doing, and so category theory. So I feel like your thing has a lot of connection to any kind of ideas I had.
Well, I'm very happy that you said that. That's great. Yeah, I'd like to speak to you more about integrated information and how it might connect to this later on.
I mean, this is kind of about the last question, I guess. We spoke about processes, and that has a temporal structure, that's part of it. But also, it seems to me something that's a bit more informational than physical, or something like that. So, when we draw those arrows, I mean, we've got a physical system, and we translate it to this other thing where we capture the interaction in some sense, kind of removed from the physical somehow.
Well, is it removed from the physical?
Well, clearly there's a correspondence there, but we kind of seem to think that that's the important one, right?
Which one? Which one is?
The information one. Sorry, it was on the right. Yeah. Is that?
So I guess
it was early on when we had you had a picture of the cell on the left and the process on the right.
Right. So yeah, let me go back to that image then.
So perhaps there's many physical systems that have that. And if we think that that's important, they would hold, kind of the important things are captured on the right in some sense. Could you clarify that relationship a little bit more?
Between this and this? Or between?
Yeah, I mean, is that true that many physical systems can have that thing on the right?
Sure, yeah.
Are they the same in some sense?
Well, I mean, I guess in the sense of having this, they're the same.
Okay, but this kind of captures what we're interested in.
Then. It captures a kind of chunk of what we're interested in. It captures what in particular it captures what Maturana and Varela thought was important for cognition. Right. So they said the idea that once you have this kind of thing, then you have precariousness, and then you have things being good or bad for you. It gives you a reason to be sensitive to them, and I guess there are people here who know these arguments better than I do. So, but the role of sorry, have I answered your question?
No, it was a bit vague. I'm just looking to kind of clarify this relationship between the process representation and the kind of true physical representation, whatever that means. Because it seems to me that we're interested in this. In some sense. So we've got to translate these physics into information somehow, and I don't know how you do that. Maybe there's a one-to-one correspondence, right? And then each physical system has got one of these, or each living system has got one of these, and then everything is different or something like that. But it seems to me that the same life can have different physical instantiation or something like that. So
yeah, I mean, this was what Maturana and Varela actually wanted to do, was to make life in a computer. It was one of the things they wanted to do, using a completely different instantiation than physics, but still capturing what they felt was the essential organization.
I was intrigued by the notion that habits lead their own lives, so to speak. And indeed, I mean, we all know for ourselves and for other people that is the case. Also, people who have a tendency to vote for a particular political party are not so likely to suddenly do something different. I wonder how broad you can take that. For example, the fact that life has a chirality, left-handed proteins rather than right-handed. Would you consider it a habit too? Or is it stretching it too far? Once you you're in the habit of having a particular chirality, it's difficult to change.
I suppose the question is, if I took a bean and magically reversed its chirality without changing its genes.
And its environment.
Oh yeah, and its environment, I suppose. But then would that bean's offspring then inherit the new chirality? I guess I'm not sure if that would make it a habit or not a habit. But it's that's nice. Yeah.
Yes. Can you tell us again why do you need individuation?
Well, it's more of an observation than an argument. So we are all distinct individuals, and we have no difficulty identifying each other as being distinct from ourselves and from each other. But there's a reason for that. I guess the point is just that is a thing that's just, we're so used to it that we don't question why that should be the case. But to me, it isn't at all obvious why it should be the case. Why on earth would biology create multiple distinct human beings that are different from one another and yet somehow still the same as each other? So it's a question, not an answer, maybe.
I think this is really essential kind of thing now. We've kind of talked about this, a couple of times throughout the summer school, but the boundary, is something that is extremely easy for us to perceive, right? And, as Nakai said, it seems like the boundary you are defining is all through the perception, actually. And the perception is, no? You don't agree. But starting from perception, then you try to come up with some kind of physical, sort of external definition of what can constitute as one individual, like, strengths of the interaction or something like that. So that, if there is a very weak interaction, then you can cut that interaction to define some kind of object, possibly. But no matter what you kind of give that kind of definition, it seems there is always an arbitrariness. Like the extended cognition kind of, argument was all about that, how much you can actually, relax or, include any kind of, boundary, right? But, in my view, this all stems from the position that, you want to define boundary from external point of view. But if you become that object in itself, like, become us, like, our consciousness has a clear boundary, and in itself, it probably may have some kind of perceived boundary in itself. That's what I'm thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, it's very much the sort of thing Maturana and Varela would say, for sure. I just wanted to make one reply to part of what you said. It's not to all of it, but that arbitrariness, I think, is kind of inescapable. So in the case of these, or in the case of cells, there's a moment where this stops being one, or doesn't seem to be a precise moment where it stops being one and starts being two. So I think that's actually a real arbitrariness in some strange sense. But yeah, there's a lot of questions. I don't know. Do you want to choose who should speak, Pete? Okay, everyone's allowing Nicholas. So.
I guess one thing I think to be careful with this individuation is it's not the same as isolation. I think that's actually a really important point. So it's not to say that because there's a dot on the screen, that dot is completely disconnected from everything around it, right? It's not saying that there is no interaction. And I think if you treat them as the same, then it feels like drawing a boundary is arbitrary. But really, all it's saying is that there's some process that makes things localized. And so that you get certain degrees of freedom that become very sloppy, that the thing will not respond to repair. So if I take one of those dots in a big empty sea and I move it 10 feet to the left, it doesn't particularly care. Nothing changes. It'll happily sit 10 feet to the left as much as it will sit where it started. And I can have two of them and move them relative to each other. And most of those motions will not cause much change in their dynamics unless I collide them. Whereas if I take one of them and I say change its concentration locally and perturb it, then the thing will undergo all sorts of dynamics to try to either recover or it's precarious and will die. So in that sense, that certain degrees of freedom become very, very lax. That is, I think, what creates this individuation, but it's not the same as isolation.
Eric?
Can I take this up just as a way to try to introduce something into the conversation? Because there's a style of arguing that seems unproductive, It's a very classical style of arguing, but we're all modern. We all know how to do statistics at some level, and so it's a trap that we should not fall into. To claim that a property X can be defined and can be quantified in some way is not refuted by the argument that X cannot be defined absolutely without exclusion, or that X provides the answer to all questions about the system, right? So it's not correct to say, is it an individual or is it not an individual, as if that were the question of being an individual or not being an individual were a precondition for the thing that we're talking about. Rather, you can say, in a system that does such and such, is there a definable conditional independence structure that we can get at statistically and that has consequences for the system's dynamics and has whatever else that we may wish to refer to as individuation? And is that a relevant property of the dynamics that preserves the system? Not is it the only relevant property. There may be many others that are also relevant in an independent way. But we don't want to fall into the sort of classic system maker's trap of trying to overuse words or use them for what they're not capable of doing. And if we're not successful at that, rejecting the use of the words at all. That's a false alternative.
So one more thing about individuation. Like, obviously not all the systems with the properties you described have individuation, right? So it's just something that could be or not could be there. But there is a consequence of that. Like, flame doesn't have individuation. And living organisms all have individuation. And I think that is because of like basically the parallel processing idea that like if you do have evolution, parallel processing finds the solution quicker. That is a consequence of individuation that could like dominate the living form. Like that argument.
Yeah, I mean, you can certainly make an argument that individuation is clearly true, that individuation is important for evolution. Mm-hmm. That if it means that your death is only your death and not everybody's death. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
One final question before the break.
It seems like since living systems are physical systems, and really there's physics and thermodynamics, it's all local interactions happening. There's kind of a necessity for individuation there, because it doesn't make sense to have one thing and another thing interact in this spatially extended way. So to have something kept in close proximity, I think would help keep it going. If you necessarily this diffuse thing in which you have chemicals exchanged across long spaces, that seems a little bit harder. So maybe individuation isn't necessarily, but it certainly helps keep things stable within the physical domain. I think
that's the case. I mean, this is stable today, the product of the simulation. It's all known. This is a global system.
But these individuals, there's only local chemical reactions taking place that keep them going.
Each one existing, or its final position depends on the position, I guess.
Yeah, there are two things here, right? One is the dots and the other is the crystal.
One is the population.
Mm-hmm.
The crystal is not individuated, but the dots are.
Yeah.
I mean, but if you didn't make atoms, you wouldn't have the crystal. So.
But there is a great point to make here, coming back to Nathaniel's. A counterpart to individuation is relatively rare among equilibrium ordered things, even though the interactions most often are local. And yet we see that a tendency toward individuation is extremely common in the dynamical processes that we regard as ordered. And somehow that demands an explanation. And I wonder if something like the combination of locality together with the finite time of flow, that you don't have time for information to propagate indefinitely before your components go down the drain. Mm-hmm. Maybe some combination of those two causes a tendency to systematic difference in the things that can organize dynamically from those that are most robustly organized statically. Mm-hmm. I don't know, but this seems to me like a really fundamental question. If there is a category distinction between the non-dissipative and the dissipative as a group, is there a single thing that is most responsible for that split of categories?
I think we should stop here and